Так, можем начинать. Минут, пожалуйста, девушки в середине стола. Пожалуйста. Значит, мы начинаем, на мой взгляд, замечательную сессию, которую я на самом деле...
So we're beginning our next session, which I love personally very much. I'm excited because we're going to have Arkady Ostrovsky talking to us, and he is a person who has I cannot say that he has the same outlook on life like me, but still. He feels the world, he sees the world, perceives the world in which he grew up like me, same way. So the same values, the same main points of values, and this is very close. And so, in spite of the difference in years, and I'm very proud that that a Russian person, a Russian, can work this way and think this way. And that the best works in such a fashion, so that the best for economists and Financial Times, the best Russian publishers, they invite him, and he acts as their correspondent. And this is a unique case, and which is not widely spread. So, but at the same time, it gives us hope for our capabilities and for our talent. And it has nothing to do with English, knowledge of English. Certainly, it's there, but it's more than that, because you have to use your brains, and it's not. It doesn't have. It has nothing to do with criticism. Because any criticism should have several alternatives. That's why I always suggest that Arkady speaks to our groups once or twice. It's not working out every time, but he owes us three or four more presentations, and so he still owes us some presentations, some speeches, and so that's why I take him up on his word. And so when Lena praises me, I feel awkward and ill at ease, because I'm trying to do something else, and so not to listen to what she's saying, and because I'm feeling that's trying to be to do something else when. She is praising me, and so then in response to Lena's words, I could say that it is true that for me it's a great honor and pleasure, and really a pleasure and honor that you come and visit and speak at the school, and because I learn a lot, and I get good feedback and from you as well. This is an amazing experience, wonderful. Not because you learn a lot, but because this school is one of the few places where I think it's an acknowledged thing that when you want to think, and thinking is a pleasurable, exciting process. So I love to think, because thinking is like swimming, like walking. So thinking is a very pleasing, pleasurable, wonderful process. Like to do any sport, for example. It's very pleasing and very rewarding. And so since everything changes so fast and around us, and we always want our conversation to be interesting and to somehow be related to what is happening right now, and not to speak in generalities, and but to pinpoint to address the issues. And I don't want just to make it in the form of a lecture, but to start talking. I would like just to broach one subject. It's the subject of time. And then to discuss it together, think together. So put our brains together, and much better rather than just I will be the only one to speak. And when I was asked how I want to title my presentation, I was thinking at that time about the name of the book, the title of the book that I was finishing, and it was kind of English, and the name, the book is in English, but the English title doesn't work in English. But in Russian it works, and so describes it's wider just and pinpoints what I am interested in Russian rather than English. And I decided to title this name "The History." So the story about the lost time, or the fairy tale about the lost time, and because the historic processes that have taken place and so still occurring, still unfolding. And I think that in order to understand and evaluate the importance of what's going on now, to have a full understanding of what's going on right now with us in Europe, in Russia, I mean, it's one of the most, I think, it's one of the most, one of the largest historic breakthroughs, tectonic changes that probably we have gone through in the last half century. And so to regard this from the viewpoint of the war that is going on now in the center of Europe. It's a de facto war going on and in Ukraine, but which is not a war against Ukraine or for Ukraine, and but it's a much more it's a bigger conflict, and so that's why I think that all these things we need to regard at the more strategic level, so more long view level. So starting from going back from the 80s, the last years of the 80s, the late 80s. And I think that we're witnessing this process that started out in the 80s and has not completed. At that time did not, because the collapse of the it was not completed. So because the collapse of the Soviet Union has not been properly and eventually performed. So it was hanging in midair, not finished. And one of the most difficult challenges of what I'm trying to describe, so when I give description to reflect the reality, this final process, this period of destruction, collapse of the empire is still coming up, and it may be much less peaceful. Although the first part was not very peaceful, if you remember all the wars that sprung along the perimeter of the Russia and in the center of Russia, and the Chechen wars and so on. But this period may become even more difficult and more bloody than what we have already gone through. And by way of an example, one comment: I think that there is a big danger, a hidden danger in what Russian propaganda is doing. And let's call a spade a spade. That's not the media; it's propaganda. It's not, and the people who rule the media, including the first and second TV channel, Ostankino channel, and the second channel, Russia VGTRK. So they're not even hiding this fact. So they not make a secret of it. Yes, they are in an information war, and that's how they perceive it. And when I talk to the heads of these two channels, they say, yes, we are at war. We are at war, in information war against Russia, as they think and Europe thinks, and so Russia attacks them. But they are in the middle of the war, and this is obvious. That's how they see it, and it's amazing that all the people who manage the Russian media, so the military profession, when they went to the Moscow State University in journalism, so then the military chair was called special propaganda. So. And controlling the occupied territory. So that was a military discipline that they had to study. So those who went to Moscow University and who had a military chair, military department, those guys had the ways of special propaganda and controlling the territory of the occupied enemy. And so we can talk more about that because the skills of this profession came in handy at a later stage. But my apprehension is that because I think that the media started it all. The TV channels started it all. And then only then the military came in. That was much later. So this was the sequence of events. So first, so we never saw this kind of war. The war is going on now in Ukraine. We've never seen similar war. So the war war that hand in hand with propaganda and TV. So there were wars that were covered. So there were wars that we could see. For example, the first Gulf War, it was on TV, Vietnam War, but we've never seen a war which predominantly in the vanguard of military actions was not headed by the military but the media. Okay, so first they created this virtual reality, and only then, having created this virtual reality, so then the virtual reality turned into real reality, and so when the troops followed the media, it's not the media that followed the troops, but the troops followed the media, and I can talk more about that, how it's organized. What scares me is so what they've done in the southeast of Ukraine. Having created this situation, so we modeled, unfortunately, what could later happen in Russia, and this is the most dangerous thing, because if there's a house on fire, going up in flames, and so there is no need to add fuels to the flames. It's very dangerous to do that. And the fire may spread. What they've done in Ukraine is, so there is a historic parallel. This parallel, what it reminds me of, and so this is the war where one of the main drivers of the war was the guy who is involved in reconstruction. So Girkin Strelkov, which is very symptomatic, because certainly reconstruction was at the heart of it. Reconstruction of what? Rebuilding of what? And I think that the closest example concerning what they tried to reconstruct are the events in Moscow in October 1993 related to the attack of the White House, attack on the White House, when the people who took up arms, and actually that was a rebellion against the Yeltsin power, and so the people who, Makashov and others, and so the fascist guys related to communists and others who came. They went to Ostankino, for example. They wanted to destroy the TV channel because they always understood that the TV and the media are the most dangerous. And it's not this Gorbachev, Chubais, Yeltsin, and their enemies, because the TV is the nuclear button, is the nuclear weapon, and so that's why first they controlled. So first they went to control the TV channel, the TV station. And what they were trying, what they're doing in Lugansk and Donetsk, they're trying to reconstruct the same events, because so the Soviet Union was still there, is still there. So the Soviet Union, so Russia has been developing much faster, and it evolved, but then Ukraine, and Ukraine was kind of ossified, mummified. It stayed the way it was, and so going back into the Soviet times, it was still that way. And actually, so these people still stayed with the mentality of the Soviet Union, Donetsk, Lugansk, and so that's why this burning material was there, and all you had to do is but the matches were Russian. And those who participate, those who were on the side of the White House, there's no need to remind us what kind of events we had in 1993. Do we have to remind? You remember that? Yeah. And so the people who were on the side of Hasbulatov and Rudskoy, and so they were in Donetsk and Lugansk. Alexander Borodai, who worked with Girkin, and he headed the battalion, commanding officer of a platoon, a battalion at the White House at that time. And we will know the Barkashovs, recordings about very similar in Donetsk, Lugansk. So, but there it worked, and always scared of such simulacra, these reminiscences. They scare me because too much in common. Because these events have their own logic. And all this, because it looks like certainly a show, but this show can later be easily transformed, transposed, and put applied on another fabric very easily, and it starts to live by its own life. And so now at Donbass they modeled the situation by the media, ideologists, and those who that actually may translate into our country. So the population of 3 times as big and so much more complicated, unlike the population of Ukraine. So they're much more ethnic and much more disparate, much more multinational, and there's so many republics, and etc., etc. And so then there's Caucasus there, and so this is much more dangerous, and then and this is horrible prospects. And so why? Because it's true that it's difficult to find another country besides Russia that would be to such extent involved in its own history, wallow in its own history. And there's no other country like that. And I don't know. So when we talk about Russia, so Donbass was never part of historic part of Russian region, and so because Nikolaev, Odessa was the Russian territory, but Donbass was never part of Russia, never was part of Russia, and so this is all. So when they where Prince Vladimir was baptized, so that's not the case. So no one was baptized in Crimea. So then Russian people. They would never relate so Crimea with the baptism of Vladimir in Khersones. So Sevastopol, that would be the line of association, but no more than that. Sevastopol, and so usually Crimea was related to the hedonistic pleasures, swimming, sunbathing, trips to the mountains, enjoying themselves, drinking wine. But religion had nothing to do with it. No associations about that. So when I was a boy, so would go to Khersones, you would be taken to where the palace, the Tatar palace, used to be, and this is it. And no one spoke that Vladimir was baptized there. So it was not even in the cards. But the country. But we are fixed. We love our history. We have this painful drive for our history, because history actually studies what has been, and that is ended. What has been ended, right? That's what it cannot study what has not yet ended. It's not history then, but this is the. But this is politology already, or whatever, journalism. But it's not history. But for an event to become history, it should finish sometime in the past. And but otherwise, it makes no sense. So to my message for real politics, because we understand that all the politicians are using the history for their own ends, but effectively. Was there Crimea, or was it part of something, or was not part of anything? And historically, so it was part of something. So maybe it's interesting for historians, but it does not justify bloodshed and victims and the murders, mass killings. It doesn't justify that. One of the first mass meetings in the epoch of Perestroika, I think it was 1988, 1989. Maybe Lena remembers, was that meeting of the people against the restrictions of subscription. You know that limitation of subscription. You understand what that is? limitation in the Soviet Union, because everything was by plan, then the circulations were identified by the state's planning committee. I mean, circulation of books. And the publishing house could not print more books than the state planning committee set. It's not how many people wanted to buy, but how many was set by, and the number of subscribers for a new edition of new books, for example, to subscribe to books as well. And there were more subscribers, then there was the circulation. And so when they talked about the abandoning so this standardized subscription, so to have as much circulation as people would consume, that was so there were lines at paper kiosks so for new papers, because they didn't print them as, so there shouldn't be any lines, because any paper should be available, because any paper immediately responds to demand by increasing circulation. But one of the meetings was to abolish subscription for Kluchevsky History of the Russian State. The Russian State. So the famous Kluchevsky's book, The Course of Russian History. And what's amazing, that people would take to the streets, and they were demanding to buy, and so there was hectic demand for historic works. And the history plays a key role from the very beginning. So since the changes started in the Soviet Union, starting from perestroika until now, because everything that Gorbachev started to do, and so the generation that comes together with Gorbachev, and so then born in the 30s and the 40s, so the people who were active in the 50s and the 60s, who were dissidents and were active in the 50s and the 60s after the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, so when Stalin was denounced by Khrushchev. And so this has to do with history. It's related to history in every possible way. And for these people, for those, so they rallied under the banners of more Leninism. Let's go back to the roots. Let's go to the grassroots, to the history. Let's go back to our fathers, because they were old Bolsheviks, ardent followers of. So many of them died in Gulag, and they were shot, and so many were close compatriots of Lenin, and so there was this Trifonovs. So then the flames of the fire, and actually they started that bonfire, and the revolution started this bonfire. And then they thought that the ideas of revolution were distorted by the years of repression and terror, and they're going back to what their fathers so told them to do. So trying just to restore so the fair background of the generation that was gone, and so going back to fathers. And and they were thinking just which way would go back, as if the history had a kind of a tape recorder mode when you can fast rewind back, for example, as if so when you can always go back to some place and to go back to square one and start again. And so the people of the 60s, so they're looking for this point in the 20s, this point of beginning of revolution, and so the ardent revolution, passions, revolutionary 20s to 1921 until the year of the tectonic change. So when they went back, to go back to the new economic policy, to Bukharin, and so the people who were starting out weren't going back. So this was the most the red refrain actually that started out and ended in the invasion of the Russian troops, Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia. So then the perestroika generation that comes 18 years later, so that's in 1967, the first one to go back to the pre-Prague invasion, to the pre-Prague spring, and until it was so squashed by the Russian tanks, and then again back to the 20s, and this unending search of where we need to go back to. and the first feelings, the first perception of perestroika, the way. So there was a good feelings because there were two good components in perestroika, key points. One was scary, and because perestroika started out under an unfortunate star and unlucky star, started with Chernobyl accident and the Chernobyl nuclear plant, and so that was a bad harbinger, so of the beginning of perestroika.
And the second topic was that topic of the return. While you're leafing through the pages of this world of the 1960s and the world with of the Novy Mir on the New World literary journal with his editor-in-chief, poet Twardowski. So this feeling of coherence with history is indeed what should we be professing as the two narratives emerging in the 1980s. One is the story of getting back to the sources and the disputes about ideology, because the generation inherited these attitudes, and then on the other hand the processes which were unfolding in the country. Of course those in the government were not keen on seeing these new elements in Russia, because this quasi-privatization, in the words of Mr. Chubais and Mr. Gaidar, when the so-called red directors started to privatize the once state-owned factories and plants. This was this beginning of the business of those who are now in the Forbes list and among Mr. Putin's entourage and close friends. Some people may be surprised to remember that the famous letter of Nina Andreeva, the neo-Stalinist escapade, which was printed in the Soviet Russian newspaper, was indeed this great challenge against the perestroika wing of the Communist Party, and there was this huge scandal which erupted when a session of Politburo was called. Alexander Yakovlev comes to this session, and Mikhail Gorbachev, and when you start reading the minutes of this Politburo meetings, when the people in the Politburo were discussing this letter of Nina Andreeva, this neo-Stalinist challenge. Now, this happened in 1987. At that same time, in 1987, a man by the name Gennady Nikolaevich Timchenko registered his first firm in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, under the auspices of the Kirishi oil processing plant, which was very soon privatized, and which then became the source of the Gunvor company, the multi-billion-dollar concern that Mr. Navalny took so much time to cover in 2011, 2012. But Mr. Timchenko is. But why am I saying this? Mr. Timchenko is a person of a very different historical period, and Nina Andreeva is a figure of the 1980s. But they start at one at the same time. One at the close of her career, the other at the beginning. So these polar tendencies in Russia at that time, the people who were at that time the chief editors, of course, did not know anything about Mr. Timchenko or Gazprom, because everybody is primarily engaged with the Council of People's Deputies. What is to be said about Gazprom? Who should care about the Ministry of Fuel and Energy? But in the end, it is the Ministry of Fuel and Energy and Gazprom which turned pivotal in the further ensuing development of the modern Russian capitalism. A newspaper which started to be published at that time was the Kommersant Daily, the first Russian big private, the first big private newspaper, started by the son of Yegor Yakovlev, the editor-in-chief of Moscow Times. This was indeed the first capitalist press, and it became one of the main mass media in the first decade of post-Soviet times. Now, clearly, this name came from the Kommersant newspaper, which was published in 1913. What was the logo of this newspaper? The famous hard sign in the Russian alphabet, which was abolished by the Soviet grammarians. What did Kommersant try to do? It tried to go back to the pre-revolutionary times, to 1913, to the last successful year of the Russian Empire. And the Soviet era seems to be omitted from this historical narrative, as if it had never been there, as if it could have been cut out, as if this civilizational episode could have been cut out from the heart of Russia's history. In that same vein, the NTV TV channel started to act as if there had never been a Soviet Union. Yeltsin's rhetoric was mainly directed at getting back to the source. We are not the ideological heirs of the Soviet Union, and the 1990s were the time of the cancellation, or indeed repulsion, of the Soviet mythological narrative. And then interesting statement of about 1991 or 1992, when somebody on the TV. Oh, it was during the first inauguration of President Yeltsin, when all attributes traditional for Russia would be observed. Now, what kind of traditional attributes of inauguration of a president could one possibly think of in the beginning of the 90s, when Russia had never had a tradition of inaugurating a president? But in any event, this attempt to get back to the pre-revolutionary times was a sign of the 1990s. So at that time, there was a general impression that the communists were curved alongside with the Soviet myths, and that nobody seemed to be interested. So in 1996, this story seemed to get finished. 1997, Leonid Parfenov, a great TV journalist and a great editor, as we now know, started with his On the Eve series of broadcasts, Namedny, or the On the Eve series, covering the Russian history from the 19th century. At about the same time, Mr. Parfenov's TV series by Konstantin Ernst about the old songs. This is an important program. This is an important story because I do not quite share the view of the likes of Marietta Chudakova, that this was a preparation of the return to the anthem of the Soviet Union. I do not think that in 1997 there was a great intent to get back to the Soviet times, and this glamour of the Soviet Union was probably not much related to the nostalgia for the Soviet times, because these TV journalists were not particularly interested in the Soviet times. They were quite successful, well off, and they certainly did not want to get back to the Soviet Union of their childhood. But interestingly, this was a symptom. This was a symptom of a new era. That this era did not have its style. This new era neither had its style nor its ideology or ideas. But something was required, and Leonid Parfenov is probably the most stylish and one of the brightest journalists who have a feeling of a time, not through the books, not only through books, but also through such things as fashion and music. And so he was not particularly interested in covering the contemporaneous times. So he did not find much style in the times that were around him. So he goes back to the story when there was a style, and of course the Soviet era did have a very distinct style. And we cannot help agreeing that the Soviet era was one of the big style eras, like in the Stalin's and post-Stalin times. From there on, while there was no style, it seemed, and of course then the terrible events ensued when the media owned by the oligarchs were immersed in the terrible quagmire of the banking wars, the information wars perpetrated by the NTV and the ORT, owned by Mr. Gusinsky and Mr. Berezovsky at that time, who were attacking the so-called young reformers in the Russian government, and the viewers must have been well disgusted by what they saw on the screens of the Russian TV at this end of the 1990s. And while they fought this war, 1998 crisis struck, that many remember today, and this whole story, this whole early capitalism saga was ended. I think that the advance of Mr. Putin as a figure of order, or a symbol of order, was predetermined. I do not think that this was only an initiative of Mr. Yeltsin's family, on an initiative of the spin doctors. Well, it is true, but the actual demand for such a strong leader was in the society, and was in a way modeled by the same mass media. And in 1998, a year before the public emergence of Mr. Putin, Leonid Parfenov made a two-part documentary about the history of the spy blockbuster of the Soviet times, The 17 Moments of Spring. And Mr. Parfenov walks the Kremlin halls and the halls of the KGB, and in a way these documentaries played a part in rehabilitating the KGB and the image of the KGB officers and the intelligence officers of the Soviet times. And of course, Mr. Putin was a part of the KGB, was not a part of the KGB of the 1930s. He was a part of the KGB which came from the 1960s, which was a different time. But so Mr. Parfenov was following, was walking these corridors, sitting in the office of Mr. Andropov and calling up somebody who must have watched this or supervised over this film 2 months before. And of course, Leonid Parfenov did not know about it. 2 months before, Mr. Putin had been nominated the head of the FSB. Some of you might remember there was a magazine with Kommersant Power, and there was even a sampling. What the people were asked, what would you like the next president of Russia to be like? And many called Stirlitz, the famous spy figure of this Soviet blockbuster, was to be like the next president of Russia. And when Mr. Putin worked for the mayor of St. Petersburg under Mr. Sobchak, he asked the documentary and the documentary person makes Mr. Putin sit into the black Volga, and so Putin as a Stirlitz, which is on the one side curious, but it is also a well understood modeling series. So there's a little bit of danger for a historian to try and analyze what happened at the time with your knowledge of today. So you cannot remodel history on your contemporary knowledge. Mr. Putin was well perceived as a right liberal person who was supposed to continue with the political course of Mr. Yeltsin, associated with the reformers, and that Mr. Putin would have to deal away with the oligarchs, and that's a good thing. And for quite a few years, almost up until 2004, Mr. Putin was viewed as a right liberal politician, until about the Yukos affair. So one of the first things that he did when coming to power, he started to deal with the reinstalling of the anthem, and indeed this was the symbolic beginning of the Putin period, and of course, irrespective of the actual content that the people who reinstate the anthem, history starts to be mocking those who try to treat it like this. And this is, in a way, a story of how an attempt is made to turn history back. It is about constructing another reality through cutting and editing, through alluding to what was there and no longer is relevant. So here are the sources of the propaganda campaign related to the Ukraine. And if you look into the encyclopedia, one can well be aware that Crimea was a part of the Russian Empire for about 150 years less than it was a part of the Ottoman Empire, that it was made a part of Russia at the end of the 18th century, and from about mid-14th century it was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And if any power that has a historical right for the Crimea, that would be Turkey. But in essence, this has nothing to do with the actual treating of the security paradigm in Europe. And so we're appealing to some historical events, be it in the Crimea or the people in the Ukraine, who are called the people of Bandera gangs. On Channel 1, there's there's a fabricated story about the rallies of the Svoboda march, and the so-called right sector only got half a percentage, but there's an fabrication of this rally with the Nazi parades in Germany. So this very liberal treatment of history is very dangerous, because you don't get far by presenting false reality. And it is always much more difficult to prove that something did not occur. You can, in many cases, you can prove that something did take place. You can say that this happened, but to prove that this did not happen is most difficult. And in this sense, this is a lot easier to try and prove that something did not take place. So this cycles, the vicious circle of history, led to Russia wasting time, squandering its time and resources. And what we see, Russia was playing this dubious historical game, which turned out mortally dangerous. At this, I shall stop, having taken 50 minutes of this session, and I apologize for this somewhat erratic way of presentation, but I will try to make up for it during the question and answer series. And I will try to talk about this in greater detail. So why did the media play such a key role in the first hybrid war of the 21st century? Yes, colleagues? Nobody from the Ukraine? Farhad Gulyama from Sochi. From the very beginning of your speech, I remembered the speakers of yesterday, Mr. Neil Makfarkwa and Andrei Babitsky. Andrei Babitsky said that the state-owned channels, primarily Channel 1, are channels which are serving a bad service to, and they're making us monsters in the eyes of the West. This is one statement. Then I heard your presentation, and I understand that those who are serving the bird service are in the vanguard of the army columns, and here, of course, Donbass, Lugansk, and Crimea are like cards in this game. So we are we've started a war, and the Western world is quite right, having introduced and entered all sanctions. Can you please tell me, a provincial, how do you perceive this? What exactly do you mean? Who started the war? Who is conducting the war? Should we collect several questions? Well, your confusion is quite well understood. Your confusion as to who is conducting this war. I think that this war is quite unusual, even compared to the recent stories. Let us take the 2008 year in Georgia. The war in Georgia had the beginning and the end of military action. It started on a particular day in August, and it ended on a particular day in August. It was declared, in a way. The amazing thing about the Ukrainian crisis is that, first of all, for a long time it was never called a war. Nobody knows when it actually erupted, nobody knows if it ended, and nobody knows when could it end. This is indeed one of the peculiarities of this military conflict, because it's a creeping war. It's a creeping war which me, as a person, and I was watching these events and I was in the Ukraine many times, I cannot give you a date of when did it actually start. Did it start by the annexation of Crimea, or did it start by the entry into Slavinsk of Mr. Girkin's squads? And so your confusion is well understood. We know that we do not know all the parties in this. We know that on the part of the Ukraine, there is the Ukrainian army, the Guard, the National Guard, some privately funded battalions like Azov on the one side. On the other side, some separatists. Who are these separatists? Are they locals? We know that there are Russians there. Who are these Russians? Are they mercenaries? Are they voluntary fighters? Are they regulars that have lost their way and found themselves on the territory of the Ukraine? There is no official data. There is no official statement. Why am I talking about media? So I well understand why you may be at a loss. I do not know what did Mr. Babitsky say, and I do not. I think that the media is not the only foundation for Russia's image in the West as of today. But of course, the people, in my view, in the press and in the Kremlin, are creating terrible risks for Russia itself. But this is a political part, which is not so interesting for the moment within the ambit of this session. We're more interested in the history of the mass media. Why do I say that the media were in the vanguard? The first, I was in Crimea. I flew into Crimea one day before the polite people turned up at the airport of Simferopol. I was in Simferopol for 4 days. And within these 4 days, it was clear that Crimea was lost, that Crimea was annexed. It was quite clear, even before the referendum. There was no local resistance, and the propaganda was quite strong, and the people were saying that the fascists are advancing upon Crimea. And the most important thing is that on the territory of Crimea, throughout this time, the Russian channels, Channel 1 and Channel 2, were most important media resources in Crimea. In 4 days, having understood that it is not particularly interesting from the standpoint of journalism, I left Crimea because I felt that it would the history would unfold elsewhere. So I went to Donetsk, and I spent quite a few time in Donetsk and Kharkov in the next month. What was I seeing in Donetsk? I was seeing very strange attempts of very marginal people, and I think he was Dubinsky. Gubarev, yes. Yes, Gubarev, who was sitting in the regional administration of Donetsk, and this was an imitation of Maidan. But this was like in Kiev, it was a sort of a carnival Maidan, because I was there throughout that time, and not a single time did I feel any danger. This was probably quite a safe place. Here in Donetsk, I did not feel safe at all. Alcohol was rife, and there was quite a bit of aggressive. There were about 100 to 200 people maximum. That man, Mr. Gubarev, was detained and then released, detained and released. The flag on the building of the Donetsk administration was changed about 5 times a day. In Kharkov, there were similar attempts, but the mayor was strong there. Mr. Kernes, who is a gangster himself, but a gangster with a sort of a local support. So Kharkov was a different story as I was watching it throughout the weeks that I spent there. Essentially, we were seeing this unfolding in front of our eyes.
And if you look back at the what was filmed then, you would see that nothing much happened, beginning with the 23rd of February till early April 2014. During the whole month of March, there were always some clashes, there were some attempts. This foolish, idiotic was quite laughable, because in Kharkov we saw the following. They had a rally for Kharkov to secede from Ukraine, and those people would come up, wave, and try to occupy the administration, but at 7 o'clock, because we were back at 8, everybody was back home, went back home. They went home, they sort of done their day's job, and they would leave. And the streets were empty. And my colleague and I, and comrade from the New York Times, and as we were going back to a hotel, just 4 hours ago, we were filming, and there's 40 reporters like they're storming this administration. But at 9 o'clock p.m., there were 3 people only, and you could occupy this. We could take it. We could occupy it if we wanted to. They tell them that we are SEALs. My friend is a SEAL. So after which they took Slaviansk, if you remember, in early April. few people know that one of the first thing that was done, and Slaviansk, as we can imagine, was occupied with the support of a group of brilliantly trained, there's nothing we can say, of Russian Spetsnaz, Special Operations Forces, the same polite friends. Few of them appeared at that time in Slaviansk. The first thing they did, and only professionals can do it, because technically it's quite a challenging work. The first thing they did, they took the TV tower, TV transmission signal, and they just established in 2 hours just special transmitters that could broadcast Russian television, because before that the government in Kiev forbade any Russian channels, TV channels. You could watch them on cable television, but they could not be watched on air using analog television, because it is a poor, very much region, and few people watch, mostly people watch plain television. What followed was that they started during weeks to, and if you remember even back then, combats were mostly centered around Slaviansk, Gorlovka. The city of Donetsk, which I visited at the time, that was quite a nightmarish education. There's some 100 kilometers, there are some battle going on, but in Donetsk life was peaceful. Women and children were playing, and people occupying this council, watching with, going about with guns, machine guns, and next to them are women and children playing in the playgrounds. But this is what started this irradiation, and this is exactly, it's like radiation with TV picture. The picture is certainly very powerful, indeed brilliantly done, about fascists. That right now, about the right sector, about rapes, and what is rising, mounting is this propaganda, again from my personal experience. What it ends in, on the 9th of May, a parade was held. Things were already coming to the boil in Donetsk, but at that time they were shooting in Mariupol. I traveled to Mariupol several hours. It is I traveled from Donetsk in several hours. There was quite a big shoot, and 12 people, I suppose, died, and there were corpses lying on the pavement. Certainly we, my colleague and I, we approached that building, and they attacked the police unit, and we tried to, they were still all in smoke and rumble, and we tried to ask people, those who were witnesses, people who just lived next door and could see it from their windows, and people started to tell me that they were just, the right sector was just here, just at this time. And I say, where? And just they round the corner, they're just somewhere around the corner. There's nobody in the streets, no right sector, and people certainly were shocked and stressed because their bodies are lying in the streets. And it is Sunday and everybody has had a drink because it's a national holiday. And they also took the armored personnel carrier, and I thought, but it was soon found out that where do they get to know that this was really the right sector, or because they don't carry like signatures on their forehead that they're the right sector. At the time they were saying, but look, it was shown on television. And this is where things get back to order. This is the first time I observed this story, just immediately after the events in Georgia, in South Ossetia, when we traveled to Tskhindval, and people would tell us horrible stories, really horrible stories, how Georgian soldiers threw grenades into the basement where civilians were hiding, and would really squash pregnant women with their tanks. And the same story, where do you get to know it? I don't know it, but it was my friend, my brother who told me, and my brother was told by his neighbor. And where does the neighbor get the story from? Well, in 3 or 4 people, we turned out that they watched it on television. And somebody who stayed in the basement in the 3-4 days and is certainly under psychological stress and does not understand what is going on and left this dark basement, and they tell him, look, this is what's happening. And he believes it, not because he is lying to me, but because he was told so, and he got to know about it from television. This is a very powerful way to sort of brainwash people, not in Mariupol, but in very poor, we should understand what Donetsk is about and the regions around Donetsk. They're very poor. Mining regions. Part of them really worked, used to work at good mines that had been built by Rinat Akhmetov. The interpreter begs to differ, thinks it was back in the Soviet times when they were built. Whereas others worked in open pits called Kopanka, and it's absolutely hazardous to work there. But people were under such stress, given that Yanukovych is somebody who was from Donetsk, was building his castle, decorating it in gold. This is where life was really very, very poor. People were basically out of jobs, and they just have a life subsistence and work this. Think of what could be. You are 40, you are a man, you did national service, you work hard, you have a child, or say 2 children, your wife cannot find a job. Well, this is all just not very happy, and the wages are pretty low compared to Russian salaries, something like 8 to 9,000 rubles per month. This is where somebody tells you, look, on television, somebody's telling it, and actually everybody doesn't care, 2 pins, whether you exist. All these 23 years, the government in Kiev and Yushchenko didn't care 2 pins, and turned out Yanukovych absolutely, and Batiko just failed you, and found out not just want to return to be bitchy, and he fled from Ukraine. There's no government around, no. And this is when on Channel 1 or Channel 2 of Russian television, in pure Russian, they tell you, you guy, you are a victim, you are a hero, and you're on the news, and you live in this Gorlovka. And it's clear nothing good will happen in your life, and you say, my God, I'm a victim here. Are those guys who are going against us? And at this time, just accidentally, it so happened, somebody got into this and handing out for free machine guns, submachine guns, AK-47, just by chance, in the central square. They just by passing by and handing it out. What does a 40-year-old man do at this time? In a while, with the exception of separatists and people who were trained by the army, there were many people, very unfortunate, where this is the only social left, where they didn't see much good about life, and who in this way were manipulated. But after the first battle, it's clear that after the first battle, especially men who did the national service, and Mesny have did it in Afghanistan, somebody in Transnistria, you sort of get immersed, they're shooting at you, you're responding to enemy fire. And this is a way of information war. Information war, it's not done to convince somebody of anything. The West, you, myself in Moscow. Yes, in Moscow you can convince, and Peter got convinced. And that's why they're supporting, although I must say, an interesting matter, you can convince them in what you want to be convinced of. And in other words, no matter how hard the Russian television would show war in Ukraine, if you look up the ratings, the Russian troops do not want the Russian troops to go there. 75% oppose the Russian troops there. When you watch it on television, but this is a remarkable service when people are asked, do you support Russian volunteers in the southeast? I don't remember the exact figures. 50% say yes, we do. Have you got a son? Would you talk him away from volunteering, or would you ban, or would you forbid him going? 70% would forbid or would not allow, and only 13% are ready to send their children as volunteers. For Russia, this is a TV story, but for people, but the main purpose of the information war is not about this. It's about involving the civilians in these regions into the state of military opposition, because Russia cannot really put the troops in there for many reasons, but the main reason is not its commitments or sanctions or whatever, but because whatever dictator or not, if 75% of your country are against it, you cannot do it. You cannot do it because you will immediately lose government and no propaganda would ever help you. If you recall one of the first interviews, one of the first sort of phrases uttered by Vladimir Putin that absolutely stunned me, and I watched it from Donetsk. On day 3 or 4 after the Crimea, for 4 or 3 days, Putin didn't utter a thing. He was not even shown on television. And the first press conference by Putin in Novo-Ogavaryovo, where he would say one thing. I'm not quoting, but not verbatim, but something like this. They asked him about southeast of Ukraine. We'll see whom they will fight. Will they fight against civilians? Because our soldiers will. What it means that first they will see civilians and then our soldiers. Does it mean that they will use civilians as a shield? This is exactly what we observed. And this is a mistake, gross mistake. When Channel 1 shows the building where they're shooting Donetsk airport, and he shows a missile that flies into, he says, and here is a granny. And there is this granny, she says, no, I won't go away, I live here. He says, now we'll get it hit back. He says, well, you'd better flee, but the granny refuses to leave. They're firing from a building where civilians live. Well, you know, this is what Hamas uses in Israel and has been using for many years. And why is it there are so many casualties? Yes, if they hide behind hospitals and schools, indeed Palestine terrorists, Israel responds and regrettably kills many civilians, children amongst them. But for it to happen, you must first to involve and radicalize locals. This is where the crime, as I see it, and the shame of Russian TV channels about this, not about fooling people's heads. Well, let them. If they want to be fooled, okay, they will be fooled. The interpreter begs to strongly differ with this. So, I do not feel that the sanctions and the economy is falling because they're French who are doing something wrong, as Gogol's wrote. Okay, let them. I'm much more worried about those people who died for absolutely nothing, and judging well, many people died. We don't know the exact figures, but thousands and thousands of innocent people died in the center of Europe. Just out of nowhere, this. I hope I in some way answered your question. Lady, you now have the floor. Please remember to give your name. My name is Natalia. I live in Russia, in Petrozavodsk, Republic of Karelia. I proudly carry the Ukrainian name Zakharchuk. My husband is Ukrainian. I hope to live to see the day when the man who unleashed this war will be judged as a military criminal. Because I, for example, consider him a military criminal. I'm very sorry if this continues, interpreter would refuse to do it. I very much hope that they will start to they would also, judgment would be returned against the Russian volunteers who fight in Ukraine. I wish well for Ukraine. Do you think Ukraine will succeed in remaining a sovereign, independent state in today's borders? Let's talk about the Crimea. I'm very sorry, Natalia, I respect your right for your own opinion. I nevertheless show you the yellow card, and I beg you please refrain from judgments and evaluations which you did for the organization which invited you to attend this meeting. I hope you understand your goof. I'm very sorry for having to do it. As to Ukraine, the story is very difficult. I also hope that Ukraine will survive and persist, that this war would stop. You mentioned illegal military units. They are indeed illegal military units. And I had a talk with, I cannot tell you the person's last name, but trust me, he's one of the, or probably the, most influential in Russia TV boss. To say the boss, it would be wrong to say so. But he's certainly a boss. But he's an outstanding personality, very talented person. And we talked about Ossetia, story about Georgia's story, about what happened in Ukraine. And I told him, look, it's all fibs. When a TV channel was speaking about the genocide in South Ossetia, if you remember, for quite a while, the Russian government used to say that the Georgians unleashed genocide there. But it turned out that, and they spoke about thousands and dozens of thousands of civilians. It turned out that 84 civilians, if my memory doesn't fail me, died. At that ethnic cleansing against Georgians in Ossetian villages did take place. I saw it with my own eyes as I traveled from Gori to Tskhinval to Vladikavkaz. Houses where Germans lived were put on fire, and there were signs when somebody wrote for going towards Tbilisi and said, look, but civilians were killed. Yes, they were. So it is genocide. So it's a matter of terminology. I said, well, and tell me please, and so much about the terms. In Russia, Russia has had 2 wars in Chechnya. Russia fought in its own territory. Did they kill civilians? I say, yes, they did. Does it turn out it's genocide? There was a pause that followed and says, well, it's a matter of terminology. Just a byword. As to Ukraine, it's a very serious question that is now a concern for all of us, for Europe, for journalists, and certainly people in Ukraine. I'm not sure. Before these events, I would say yes, Ukraine, without any external influence, will prevail as a state, but I realize that in case of external influence, Ukraine will find it hard to remain as a single state, and that the disintegration can begin at any time. You say, let's forget about Crimea. I, in this situation, would rather put it this way. I would rather stay away from even Donetsk and Lugansk, all the regions which are now controlled by separatists. It seems to me that in this time, it's clear that having a neighbor such as Russia, it's clear that Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, doesn't really need Donbass. For me, that was obvious from the very start, that Donbass is not much needed. Ukraine really didn't need it much, judging by what they did to it, didn't do anything about it for 23 years. Let alone, it is not needed by Russia. Old mines, who needs this coal? Russia is a coal exporter. So Crimea, it's a small territory, and something may be developed there, and in terms of population, it's not how many are there. 2 million, if not even fewer. Let's put it as 2 million. Whereas Donbass, excuse me, this is some 15 million, 15, or maybe 20. I mean, the whole region of the southeast of Ukraine. And to accept this responsibility under such economic situation, one has to be suicide. So Russia doesn't need Donbass. That's why Russia didn't recognize even the election. I suppose the purpose in the long run is even further partition and with a former post-Soviet space, but I do not suppose that Russia will put the troops there or would take part in the military partition of Ukraine. if it does happen, we will not speak about the war in Ukraine. Then we'll speak about all-out war in the world. It will be even a matter of the Third World War. Let's hope that it will never live to see this day, though nobody can give you any guarantees. But why am I saying it? Whatever what might be your take to the policy of in Europe, that Russia pursues in Europe or wherever, I do not think that Russia will intervene in the military way. What does not at all mean, and this is part two, that Ukraine will survive, because the thing is that in order to, whether Ukraine will survive or not, it depends upon its elite, because the elite are not in the better, if not in the worse condition that it is in Russia. Because the people who lived in excellent Ukrainian cities certainly are 3 heads ahead of the elites. You see, when in Kiev, at the time when a military operation is underway, people in the government of the Ukraine are continuing to illegally splitting the budget. When the Ministry of Defense, think of it, it is the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, is making money by trading, by illegally selling the ammunition and the military equipment that was intended for the volunteers who volunteered to defend their country. What companies do, there are some people who are responsible towards their stuff, like major companies, where young people quit and because they went to war. These companies decided they would buy these vests, armored vests, and they turned out to be used. They already used, and they already used and cannot serve anymore because they've already been hit by a bullet. They just surface them into the new tissue, some new cloth. So Ukraine is now under a very severe economic collapse, and not because of Russia, but mostly because of its own efforts. And at that, instead of doing reform and immediately liberalizing its economy and attempting to save it, instead what they do, they're going for their internal just quarreling. Recently I attended the funerals of one of the most remarkable statesmen of our time, as I said, Kacha Bendukidze, a man who carried out reform in Georgia, an incredibly outstanding person. Let him lie in peace, let him rest in peace, who, as it turned out, he died 58 and he had very little money left. For the last several years he traveled to Kiev trying to do something there, pro bono. You know, a very big man in every sense of the word. A reformer. He traveled to Kiev, attempting to, because he had some experience of carrying out economic reform. As I found out during his funeral, Pyotr Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, did not find any time, not even once, to meet him in person. Do we need to further speak about reform about Ukraine? No. All this talk by Ukrainian officials that will now carry out reform, they have a long list of plans. You can, well, throw it away or nail it to the wall, because there is no plans that are needed. You need to work. And if the Ukrainian government continues to do what it is doing now, I suppose probability is under 50% that it will survive within the borders it exists today. The question is, why is it that Rinat Akhmetov, though he has major resources at hand, why did he distance himself from the situation, knowing that he be among the losers, which he actually in point of fact is? Why did he not take part? Well, you know, probably he did not get enough imagination. He did not out to be that smart. You know, he's very shrewd, but he gambled. He gambled he made a fortune by gambling, by playing cards on the trains, suburban trains, commuter trains. You know, he's very person-prone to, but he, probably got carried away with the games. But gambling, he thought about these political games. I think, it's not that I think, I know that Rinat Akhmetov, we have even documentary witness when Khodorkovsky traveled to Donetsk And when in Donetsk things were more or less calm, and they had a talk. Yulia Latinin attended the talk. Somebody else attended the talk. Khodorkovsky talked to Akhmetov. Akhmetov invited him as a guest. Khodorkovsky was asking him something, and Akhmetov picked up the receiver and invited Pushilin. And it was clear that Rinat Leonidovich is financing in part what is going on, thinking that in this way he will get to bargain with Kiev. So he thought he would bargain with Kiev, and at a certain time he would put the pressure upon them, and they will give him away the ports in Odessa. This is exactly the condition Ukrainian elite is in, who did not think about the country as if it were their own country that they needed to defend. Instead, they thought, how else can we make money? How else can we put the pressure on somebody so that I could get more posts in the cabinet of ministers? Well, a person like Rinat Akhmetov, it turned out that he could be easily used for the sake of any other state, because if you're corrupt, then you're corrupt for good. And at a certain time, I suppose, he could no longer control the situation. He was just used all out. And Mariupol, as far as I know, they defended it by. But it was too late in Donetsk, and he was just disregarded. And he got too carried away. And I suppose he bears a great deal of responsibility for what took part. And the very fact that his people are still in the Rada. And you know, it's just, I don't understand how it can be. The country overthrew Yanukovych. Who was the main financier? It was Rinat Akhmetov. Can you imagine how many people put in place by Akhmetov in the Rada? Can you imagine? Well, dear colleagues, our time is up, or rather, it is up. Dear colleague, sitting next to the wall, you now have the floor. Good evening. Evgeny from Sevastopol. I will, in your presentation, the thrust of your presentation was the fact that any work with history, with unwinding history, it's negative, and the story, it's not like a tape. It's not a audio cassette. And any attempts to rewind it ended in even further problems at the next stage. Let's go back to Crimea and to the question about the Crimea. Let's imagine that, say, Ukraine survived. That Ukraine survived as a single state. No matter if the elites changed or not, third Maidan or not, without Maidan, somehow it survived. As a minimum, at least, they froze the question about the southeast. Then there is Crimea, which is de facto under the governance of the Russian Federation. And the question must be resolved. Here several options could be to freeze, to unwind, as nobody knows how, and cannot do. Or what to do? Can you imagine that all the other questions are more or less frozen or maybe resolved? What do you do? How do you leave this situation? I certainly have no answer to this question. Nobody has the answer to this question. Well, there are different ways to answer this. There are ways to sign probably a new delineation of new borders, which is always a danger because you don't know where you can stop, how many times it can be done. If you can do it once, why you cannot do it twice on these controversial territories between, say, Poland and Germany? So probably, yes, you can say that Crimea is part of Russia. Donetsk, okay, let it be part of Russia, but Ukraine, say, is a member of NATO. This is where the red line goes, on the Dnieper. But we're not, not trying to be judgmental. We're not in a situation of 1940, when there are politicians in Russia, in the Soviet Union and in Europe who, in this way, divided and had this vision of the situation. Although maybe that might not be the worst option. Another thing I wish to make, the question whether Ukraine will survive. I don't suppose there will be any third Maidan. If there is, then it will not be a Maidan. Because people who would be back and who spilled blood, literally, all these months, they would be back home not wearing wooden shields, the Maidan. I do not quite even understand why some illusions can be entertained at this expense in Kiev. on this topic. I suppose it will be a very difficult process. With Crimea it will be very hard, because I was not even saying it's dangerous to unwind. I suppose to use history for political purposes, for political ends, it's very dangerous as a kind of legitimation of actions to capture other territories. We know that it was one of the arguments by Hitler. I'm not drawing any parallels here, but when Hitler was capturing the Sudets, historical justice or injustice, Mussolini was saying that Abyssinia, that is Ethiopia, must be part of Italy and Roman Empire, because that it was what it was in the times of Julius Caesar. Well, this is very dangerous path to travel. But I think that no doubt that the fate of Ukraine, of Crimea, should be addressed and resolved by, indeed, the people who live in the Crimea, and as endorsed by both Russia and Ukraine, with Ukraine and Russia. I do not perceive as the election, the referendum that took place, as legitimate. Before that, they had a putsch that took place, because actually the legislative body of the Crimea was dispersed, as we know, because it all started, if you remember, with capturing the Duma, or rather the Supreme Rada in Crimea, after which the doors were shut and under machine guns, literally. Some deputies, God knows how many of them, voted. They sent SMSs to, rather, it was more like SMS voting rather than in persona voting. What the government says that happened because of the honest election. No, it was not. Because the legislature of the Crimea was under external pressure of some unknown people with carrying machine guns. Nobody was let in. It is impossible to confirm it all, so they should carry out new election, indeed quite legitimate, as endorsed by Ukraine. They should carry out some referendum, as a result of which, but this is an objective for diplomats, and I say it's an objective for many, many years to go, and you should be judged by political reality. Russia will not return the Crimea, especially given that, well, it's not clear to whom really to return. But the very fact that this story will reverberate for many years to come, in this sense, I feel very sorry. I feel very sorry for Russia, a country where I was born and raised, because for Russia, certainly, this is a major blow. This sort of isolation, this cutting oneself off, shutting oneself up from the world. Indeed, well, adult people, you know, probably carry responsibility for this because they continue to support. But the kids that will grow in this country, they surely are not to blame. That this happened this way, and that will be a stumbling block for many years to come. Dear colleagues, our time is up, so no more questions will follow. We are probably slightly already over time. I'm very sorry, it's my fault. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. Or rather, I allowed this as a moderator for us to somewhat delay this. I feel I'm in a very difficult situation because I feel to wrap up, but I will not do it. At the same time, certain remarks that we heard and to which I already responded. You know, what we're dealing here, we can go for political analysis and political judgment, but the status of our organization as an organization of civic education does not allow us to do any on calling somebody for political action. So I urge you, colleagues, to take it into consideration, how acute the situation is, how sophisticated and difficult our life can be, this complexity of life that Lena always urges us to practice at all times. I'm not probably discussing it any further. You now received food for thought as you listen to experts. I congratulate you on this. And I suggest we should thank the speaker, please.
Коллеги, перерыв 23 минуты.